What is good, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Terminator Training Show. I am Kevin Smith. I am back from a little bit of a lull in the action. Went to LA area to visit my wife's family. A couple of my nephews were born 3 days apart, and they just turned 2. So we usually go out there in July. And also my mother-in-law, my wife's mom, also has a July birthday, all in the same week. So very convenient, and we usually go out to LA area for that week every year in July. And then thereafter, I flew up to Seattle for a little bit of a business conference with a cohort that I have been part of for the last several months. It is kind of like a group business coaching cohort. And they do 2 in-person events a year, and it happened to be in Seattle, and I happened to be on the West Coast anyway. So it worked out nicely. I didn't have to fly all the way back to the East Coast and then fly up to Seattle from the East Coast. We just kind of went to LA, flew straight up to the Pacific Northwest, and stayed there for a few days. And now I am back on the grind. And speaking of being back on the grind, super pumped to announce that Ruck Run Lift is officially out. If you are hearing this within the first couple days that the podcast comes out, you're in luck. If you're interested in the program, it is 25% off until the end of the day on August 3rd. That is Sunday, August 3rd at 11:59. And the code RRL25, no space. So the letter R, the letter R, the letter L, 25 with no space is the discount code. So that discount is active until the end of the day on Sunday. So if you're interested in that, hop on. And I am really excited that it's finally out. This took a lot of work behind the scenes. Not just for me, but also my wife, who once I finished the X's and O's and once I finished putting the program together, I send it over to her and she goes over it with a fine-tooth comb, make sure everything is comprehensive and understandable, and make sure I didn't do anything crazy. And also she makes it look pretty, and then she puts it up on the site. So definitely a big thanks to her for helping out, and super excited about the fact that she's also part of the team officially. That is her full-time job. And we are looking forward to continuing to build TTM and have a good time doing it. So anyway, today we're going to get into some questions from my recent Instagram Q&A. Got quite a few. So I'm going to go through and pick some of the better ones and give you guys some answers. Hopefully you can implement these things into your life to improve. And if you want your question answered in the future, give me a follow, Terminator_training. Look out for my usually bi-weekly Q&As where I put them in my stories, and you can ask whatever you want. And if it's a good question, and or if it's a question that I happen to see, sometimes I don't get to all the good questions. Sometimes I just kind of go in order on Instagram, but I try to do mostly the better questions here on the podcast, as well as kind of choose based on questions that I may not have answered on Instagram. So that's what we're going to do today. And without further ado, let's hop into the first question. Is training forearms a waste of time or something to invest in? If you want bigger forearms, then it's not a waste of time at all. Just like any other muscle, the forearms can grow if you train them. However, some people don't need to train forearms at all. If you generally put on muscle easily, just you're more of a mesomorph, or someone who, you go into a weight room and it's pretty easy for you to put on muscle, and you don't really have any like weak lagging muscle groups, like your calves are well developed, your arms are well developed, and they just get that way through basic training. You don't do anything crazy, and it's not like a super high effort thing for you to put muscle on in general, then your forearms are probably going to grow kind of in proportion to the rest of your arm. Assuming you train arms and you train other parts of your body, you do pushing, pulling, and arm work, your forearms are usually naturally just going to tag along for the ride. However, if you're like me or other people who are they have a difficult time genetically putting on muscle, especially on their limbs, their calves, their arms especially, then you probably will not see a lot of forearm growth from just general arm training and push-pull training. And therefore, if you want bigger forearms, you might have to train them. It's kind of like the calves. The guys with the best calves and gals with the best calves in the world are not also the guys and the gals that train calves the most optimally, if that makes sense. A lot of guys with massive calves and gals with massive calves don't really train them all that much. They're just kind of genetically big. And I like to compare the forearms to the calves. So if you just generally have tiny calves and you also generally have lacking forearms, then they're probably not going to grow all that much from doing your basic arm training and your carries and things like that. So in that case, you absolutely can. And it's not really all that complicated. Just some wrist flexion exercises. So any sort of dumbbell wrist flexion, any sort of dumbbell wrist extension, or barbell, or really whatever is going to be totally fine. You can do some isometric stuff like really heavy carries. You might see a little bit of growth, especially if you have really good forearm genetics or general genetics like that. But that's more isometric, doesn't really have an eccentric or a concentric. So it's probably not going to work all that well if you don't have genetically responsive forearms to general training. So any sort of training like that, wrist flexion, wrist extension, progressive overload, same rep ranges, you can train them with decently high volume. Just kind of be aware that because you are using your forearms as a secondary support muscle in a lot of upper body lifts and even some lower body lifts like hinges and things like that, even if you are wearing straps, you're still going to be using your forearms a little bit. They can be overdone. So I would start pretty low volume and kind of work your way up over time. I would say 5 to 8 sets of direct forearm work per week would be a good starting point. Take him close to failure. Make sure you're doing it too on a day where, like the next day, you're not going to be doing a heavy upper body lift. Because if your forearms are fatigued and tired going into that upper body lift, it's probably going to affect you a little bit in that lift. So you can do forearm training on leg day. You can do forearm training like after you hit arms. You maybe have a rest day or a lower body day the following day. That would be solid options. So yeah, if you are just someone who has small joints and is genetically having a difficult time putting on muscle in general, especially on your limbs, then forearm training is definitely fruitful. If you care about them, it's not like a make or break thing, but if you have like jacked arms, upper arms, and no forearms, which would happen to me if I never trained my forearms, then you can consider training them and they will absolutely grow. If you do it right, it's really not all that complicated. Next question, what do you mean when you say lab work for recovery? Specific blood test recommendations? So in another question on my Instagram, I answered a question about how to tell the difference. I believe it was the difference between underfueling and overtraining and just general under recovery. And one of the bullet points I had on there that you can kind of consider is to get your labs done to kind of see what's going on under the hood. So depending on where you go, oftentimes the lab work may be sufficient, like the general lab panels that they naturally give you. You don't really have to request anything. It may be sufficient to kind of see what's going on. I'll go over them here in a second. But other times, especially if you're going to like your GP and they really just want to make sure you're not dying or diseased. I've talked about this in the past where if you go to your GP or your regular doctor for like a checkup and you request lab work, they're going to give you like the bare minimum. And if you are in the normal range, just the general normal range of everything, they're going to tell you you're fine. And that can be problematic because the normal range is based on the averages or the medians for the average American. And if you think about it, I personally would not really want to have the same lab work as the average American, if that makes sense. Whereas if you go to a place that kind of specializes in male hormone optimization, such as Merrick Health or Blokes, or there's any number of different online telehealth networks that do this, they're in the business of making sure you're optimized and ready to crush and perform and feel great, not just not die and not be diseased. So there's a huge difference. There's normal ranges as far as like the average American, and then there's normal ranges that these companies use to determine whether you're in that optimal range or not. And they're very different. For example, testosterone. Everyone knows about testosterone, right? So the normal range of testosterone, if you just go to a GP, is going to be something like 300 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. That is a massive, massive, massive range. The same dude at 300 versus 999, by the way, they're both normal, is going to feel totally different, nowhere near the same. And this is coming from someone who's been at both places. It's night and day. But if you go to your GP, they're just going to tell you you're normal. Same with vitamin D. I think the normal range of vitamin D is like 50 to 80 or 50 to 100 or something like that. And if you're at 51 versus if you're at 90, you're going to feel totally different. Your health is going to be in a totally different spot between the two, but your GP is just going to tell you you're normal regardless. Even if you're lower than 50, they're probably going to tell you like maybe take some vitamin D, but maybe not even. So it's very important that you make the distinction between where you're getting labs done and you're at least aware. If you go to your GP, you might have to ask and request for certain things to kind of like see where you're at. Yes, you definitely have to pay if you go the telehealth route. However, there are certain insurances that do cover at least some of it. And even if they don't, like mine doesn't, I think it's a very worthwhile investment. I use Merrick Health. Again, not required to use that, but that is just one option. And either way, if you are interested in going to get lab work done, and this is kind of like for recovery, but also just general health, like some of these things are indicative of your overall health, performance, recovery, but honestly, health, performance, and recovery are all kind of very similar. So the general lab panels that I would recommend, and again, most of these labs that you get are going to have most of these on there, but just so you're aware of what you're kind of looking for, a CBC, which tests things like hematocrit and hemoglobin and your white blood cell count, your platelets, just very important to see the health of your blood in general. Like if you have high hemoglobin, your body is generally going to be better at transferring or transporting oxygen to your tissues. Within reason, you don't want it too high. You don't want any of these things there's a Goldilocks effect with every single lab value. So you don't want things like way outside the normal range high, nor do you want it outside the normal range low. So CBC is going to be on generally every lab. So is a CMP. That tests things like HbA1c, your glucose, your liver and kidney functions, like basic liver and kidney functions. If you have a history of liver and kidney issues in your family, then they do have more specific tests for those organs. And those are very important organs for your well-being, your recovery, your health, etc. But the CMP, Complete Metabolic Panel, will cover the basics for those organs. Lipids is another one. Things like triglycerides, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, your ratios, basically getting a good look at what your lipids are doing. That one's going to be on most blood tests as well. Additionally, hormone panels. This is a very important one just for performance, recovery, well-being. So obviously it's going to test things like your testosterone. It's going to test things like your cortisol. It's going to test your estrogen. And those are all really important hormones to kind of have in balance and functioning properly. Inflammation and cardiovascular markers, those are kind of optional. You might have to request those, but they test things like CRP and homocysteine, which are definitely very relevant for potential heart issues down the road, as well as they kind of give you a look under the hood at how inflamed you've been recently. And if you're super highly inflamed, then you're probably a little bit lacking in the recovery department. Additionally, and this is going to be present on most labs, is a thyroid panel testing things like free T3, free T4, TSH, etc. A well-functioning thyroid is very important for well-being, recovery, performance, your metabolic rate, your energy and vigor throughout the day. And then probably something like a vitamin and mineral test that kind of looks at vitamin D, iron, folate, B12. That's most likely going to be on most panels, but just in case it's not, that's what you can request to. That's a pretty good start. You can get way, way, way more comprehensive, and labs are not just blood. You can test your hair, you can test your feces, you can test your saliva for certain things. That's going a little bit too into the weeds for this discussion, but those are all considerations. And just getting your lab work done, honestly, and looking at it with an eye towards optimization rather than just not dying or not being diseased is super critical. And the best way to do that is not to kind of like decipher them on your own. And it's not, again, to go through your GP, because your GP is just going to tell you you're fine if you're in the normal range. It's to actually have a professional interpret them for you. And that's the main benefit of going through these telehealth networks, is that they have people that are experts at this, that look at your labs and will give you guidance on what to do in order to improve or maintain the good things, and so on and so forth, whether it's lifestyle, nutrition, training, or pharmaceuticals or supplementation. They are kind of the whole gamut. So highly recommend considering it if you are a male over the age of like 20, 21, getting lab work done. Even if you feel great, I would argue if you feel great now, that's an even better reason to get lab work, because it gives you a baseline back when you felt good. this is what my labs looked like back when I was 21 and I felt amazing. Now I'm 35 and I feel like shit. So let's compare. So that is my spiel on lab work. Highly recommend, and not just for recovery, but just about everything, well-being and health and performance. All right, next question. Best programs to run for an option 40 and a year out from shipping. So option 40, RASP contract. So you're going in, it's kind of like an 18 X-ray except for Ranger Regiment. And if you have a year, I would say it does depend on where you're at as far as fitness, and it kind of depends on what things you need to improve the most. But you can't really go wrong with any of my hybrid programs, Gazelle 2.0. You can't go wrong with 2 and 5 mile. I probably would not follow like SFAS. I would probably not follow Ruck Run Lift right yet. You could probably consider Ruck Run Lift a little bit later on as you get closer, but honestly, that's more of a selection prep program. And if you were to follow, for example, Gazelle, then Gazelle 2.0, then 2 and 5 mile, that would cover a good like 10 months or so and put you in a really good situation. And then you could restart Gazelle 1, or you could restart Gazelle 2, or you could even just kind of restart 2 and 5 mile when you're done as you get into like basic training and things like that. That would be probably a pretty good order, but it does depend on, if you're a really, really weak runner, maybe following 2 and 5 mile 2 times throughout the next year might be a good idea. Maybe not back to back, maybe split them up with a different program in between, but kind of depends. If you're really weak, maybe following Gazelle original two times throughout the next year might be a good idea. So it does depend, but those are all really solid options for pre-OSIT or pre-option 40 or 18 X-ray contract. Just depends on kind of what you're going for most. Next question, any plans for a long walk prep program? Yep, it is out. It is not specifically only for the long walk, but it absolutely is appropriate for the long walk. In this program, I'm going to do an entire episode where I kind of break things down, but just real quick, in this program, depending on what selection you're going to, you will see different options on different days for different training. So if you're going to SFAS, you follow the SFAS prep guidelines. If you're going to, or honestly, SFAS and RASP and MARSOC are all kind of similar. But if you're going to the long walk, it's going to be a little different. There's going to be more rucking. There's going to be less specific like strongman stuff because you don't do that really there. You just do a ton of rucking and a little bit of running. So that program is great for the long walk, and I would check it out. Again, the code is RRL25 if you're listening to this the first couple days it comes out. So that's what I would go for. Next question, what is the sufficient time between SFAS and Sapper school? It really depends on how much selection beat you up, and it depends on like your general fitness levels. Honestly, some guys who are complete studs could go to Sapper a couple weeks after they finish SFAS. Would I recommend that even if you are a stud? Not necessarily, but if you prepared really well for SFAS and you finish this SFAS not super destroyed, which is very possible. Some guys finish SFAS absolutely wrecked. Other guys finish SFAS kind of like in the middle. Other guys feel pretty damn good. They can get back into training pretty quickly after. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend just going ham right after regardless, but easing back into it pretty soon after you finish. So it really depends on all those things. I would say anywhere between 2 months and 6 months would probably be reasonable. 6 months for people who get completely destroyed at SFAS. 2 months, maybe even 6 weeks for those who are like really well prepared and just recover really quickly. So that's a good range to consider. Hopefully that helps. Next question, ever seen or dealt with shoulder or elbow issues from the leg press bracing handles? No, I actually haven't. I have definitely experienced guys getting kind of messed up from certain bracing, but I haven't heard the leg press. Honestly, I would maybe consider putting some straps or grips on if you're gung-ho about leg pressing and really cranking down on the handles. Honestly, it is the right way to do it, is to grab the handles and really pull your butt into the seat. That way you are creating more stability and you will be able to put more force into the plate and therefore get better results from it. And if it's bothering you, it would be hard for me to picture how it would bother your shoulders that much unless you have some weird setup leg press. Some leg presses are a little bit strange in the way that they have the handles, but I can see a little bit of overuse forearms, maybe elbow area, in which case some straps or grips would be a solid idea. That way you're not cranking down with your hands. You just put the straps or grips around it, and that kind of takes care of the grip and it'll just lock you in. I've actually used them before on leg presses. I've used them before on leg extensions and other things that are like really beneficial to brace on. Honestly, most people don't brace that much on these. Some people don't even put their hands on the handles, which is a mistake in my opinion. But either way, you can try that. Other than that, I would maybe work on some mobility. It could be a combination of other things you're doing. Like you might be doing overhead press type movements with either bad form or maybe too much volume, or you could be doing a ton of pull-ups, a ton of overhead pulling, and maybe it's a little bit too much volume, and or you're just performing pull-ups or other overhead pulls or pushes with poor technique. That could be kind of sparking the issue, and then maybe you are sitting on a leg press and it's exacerbating it a little more. For example, I used to have serious shoulder issues from squatting. I would do low bar squats on usually the first day of the week, Monday, and then I would go into my upper body session on Tuesday and my shoulder would be bothering me before I even start my upper body session because I was holding the bar in a weird position. So it could be that, it could be overhead stuff. A lot of people have shoulder and elbow issues or one or the other because they lack shoulder mobility, they lack overhead mobility, and they still do a bunch of lifts that require really good overhead mobility. And so it just bangs their shoulders up. And then some other things can potentially exacerbate it, like in your case, the leg press. So I would try straps or grips. I would consider doing some dead hangs, working on your overhead mobility, monitoring and maybe taking a look at your other training to see what potentially could be bothering it, checking your technique, making sure that's dialed in, and hopefully over time that issue kind of stops bothering you. But for now, as an adjunct, try wearing straps or grips. That way you're really not focusing on actually grabbing down really hard on the handles. You can just rely on the grips for that, and it'll still make you really stable for the leg press. Next question, is it reasonable to omit time trials during summer in the 2 and 5 mile program? Smoked by 70 plus dew points. Actually, this is a phenomenal question, and yes, it absolutely is. Either that, or you could potentially do them on a treadmill inside. It's not going to be perfect one-to-one comparison, but it can still give you a good solid look at where you're at, especially if you do like the pre-program time trials and the mid-program time trials and the post-program time trials on a treadmill, and you didn't do like the pre-program time trials outside when it was nicer out, then the mid-program time trials on one or the other, because it's just hard to standardize. Just treadmills are not perfectly calibrated to outdoor running. But you could consider that, or you could consider just waiting. Any of my programs, you're not required to do the time trials. That's just kind of to check your progress and see where you're at. But I will say many guys think they got really slow and unfit throughout the summer because their times are worse. And it's not the fact that they got slow and unfit. It's the fact that the dew point being 70 or higher. Some dew points are like today in North Carolina, the dew point was like 81. And trying to do a 5 mile time trial in 81 dew point, you're just going to be significantly slower than you're capable of running because of the dew point, not because of your fitness, because of the weather and its effects on your core temperature and your ability to perform, not because you're unfit. You got less fit throughout that time. So if you are doing the time trials and it's the summer and it's hot as fuck, just keep that in mind. If you're slower at the end of a phase or at the end of the program, or if you're not that much faster, not as faster as you wanted to be, it's probably not because you just did a long ass program that works really, really well for pretty much everyone who follows it and somehow got less fit. So for example, I have a client who lives in Florida. He did an SFRE. These times may not be exact, but he did an SFRE back in April, and his 12 mile ruck was, I want to say it was 2:04. He's a stud, by the way. Like, you don't have to be that fast. But anyway, 2:04. And then last week or 2 weeks ago, he lives in Florida, and I gave him a time trial because he's going to selection. I gave him like his 8 week out from selection time trial, and it was a 10 mile ruck. And I think he finished the 10 mile in like an hour 58. So only 6 minutes faster than his 12 mile that he did in April. And he's way fitter now and way more prepared as far as rucking's concerned. And he was very concerned about it. And I had to kind of talk him off the ledge and tell him, like, dude, this is not perfectly indicative of where your fitness is at right now. You are way, way faster than that. It's just the fact that I think the dew point was like 82 when he did his 10 mile ruck. So I'm glad he's like, okay. But it is a big time factor. The heat is a big time factor in your performance. And if you want to hear more about that, I would go check out a recent episode. What episode was it? I want to say it was like 173 or 170 or something like that. Just type in heat training on either YouTube or Spotify or wherever you listen, and it should bring you to it. It's in the 170s, I believe. And that'll give you a good idea of why you potentially might want to omit time trials, like the question said, this time of year. And also, it'll just give you an idea of the potential benefits, precautions, and ways to approach heat training, and also the effects it has in your body, the reasons why you are going to be slower when it's hot out, and a bunch of other information on heat training. So yes, reasonable for sure, but you could consider doing a treadmill time trial, or you could consider just doing it and being aware and okay with the fact that you're not as fast as you maybe want to be, given the fact that you just did the program because of the weather, not because of your fitness. Next question, advice on getting enough carbs in. I'm good at hitting my protein, but need more carbs. Hell yeah. This is right up my alley because I am a big time carb zealot. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but I really like to eat a lot of carbs, and I really like to introduce my clients to what it feels like and what your performances look like when you finally start eating lots of carbs. A lot of people think they eat plenty of carbs, but there's a difference between plenty of carbs and enough carbs to fuel your performance. And usually that gap is pretty big. And a lot of people are kind of fearful or hesitant to crank their carbs higher because they've been told that carbs make you fat. And that is absolutely not true. Most people lump carbs into foods like pizza and muffins and donuts. And yes, those foods do have carbs in them, but they also have a shit ton of fat in them and therefore a lot of calories. So if you're sticking to, I'll go into them in a second, but if you're sticking to like mainly actual carbs that are mostly to all carbohydrates as far as their macros are concerned, then, and you're monitoring your fat, you're making sure you're not eating tons and tons of fat too, so you're in like this massive calorie surplus, then you're going to benefit tremendously from it. Not everyone benefits tremendously from super high carbs. Everyone's different, but most people, generally speaking, that have performance goals are going to benefit from increasing their carb intake. And my recommendation is to find a couple of different sources of carbs and really crank down on them. So generally what you're going to want to focus on most is the ease of the digestion, the ability to digest your carbs without you feeling bloated or terrible all the time. And everyone's a little different, but there are some universally easy digesting carbohydrates that I would recommend prioritizing. So white rice is hands down the easiest digesting carb. Yes, it's refined. Yes, it doesn't have as many nutrients as brown rice, but brown rice is rough on most people's gut. And the nutrient difference is not like going to be a make or break thing. If you're eating generally nutrient dense foods like red meat, fruit, vegetables, then you're not going to be missing out on the difference in nutrients between brown rice and white rice. So you can eat a ton of white rice. If you are more in the market for losing weight or cutting, then you might want to consider something a little bit more filling. So regular potatoes, sweet potatoes are great for that. They're just more filling than white rice, and they are very easy to digest. And they're also very high in carbs, and they go well with a lot of different things. Sweet potatoes you could eat for breakfast. Regular potatoes you could eat for breakfast, lunch, dinner, doesn't really matter. So those would be like the top two starches that I recommend. Oatmeal's great, but not for everyone. Oatmeal can be a little bit rough on the gut for some people, including me. So if you like oatmeal, but you don't digest it well, I would consider something like rice and grinds. It's made by Pride Foods. I think you have to buy it online. I've never seen it in a store before, but it's called Pride Foods Rice and Grinds. It's kind of like a oatmeal alternative that is rice based. And honestly, for me and for some of my clients, it digests even easier than white rice. So that stuff's amazing. I like doing that peri-workout, pre-workout, post-workout, either or both. And like I said, it's just you basically can either microwave it with water, or you can put it in a pot and cook it like oatmeal. And it comes out and it's kind of similar to oatmeal, and they make really good flavors too. What I usually do is I cook it, and it's super duper hot, of course. So I put a bunch of frozen berries in a bowl, and then I pour the rice and grinds over it. And that kills two birds with one stone. It cools down the rice and grinds so I can eat it immediately. And it also warms up, heats up the fruit, so the fruit is not frozen solid. So that's a little pro tip for you. I usually put like a scoop of peanut butter, sometimes a scoop of protein, unless I'm eating eggs or something on the side, and it's delicious. So those would be like my top 3. Fruit is great. Fruit's not going to be enough on its own, but you absolutely can eat fruit. Don't fear fruit. Eat a ton of fruit. Bananas are probably the most carb heavy fruit that I can think of, but really any fruit is going to work just fine. Sourdough bread is another really good one. Sourdough bread is very easy to digest if you get the right stuff. If you get the stuff at the store that has like 35 ingredients, it's not as good. It's definitely better than like white bread, and it's probably better than wheat bread, whole wheat bread, or any variation of those breads. But if you eat a ton of white rice, potatoes, any kind of potatoes, fruit, sourdough bread, you are going to be cooking with gas. And if you throw some rice and grinds on there, even better. From there, I mean, there's a bunch of other options. You can have some more refined carbs around training, like bagels or white bread or something similar to that. Basically, what you're looking for is foods that are mostly or all carbohydrates and don't have any other macronutrients. You said you're already good with protein, so that's awesome. But where people run into issues is when they have really, really high carbs, but that carb is, like I said earlier, something like pizza or a muffin that's super high carbs, super high fat, and therefore high calories. So that's what I would recommend. As far as getting enough in, start early, start in the morning, and eat carbs on a regular basis. You can consider doing some carb cycling where you eat higher carbs on training days and maybe higher calories, and lower carbs away from training or non-training days. But that's not really necessary for everyone. I do like to calorie cycle with my clients, and we mostly manipulate carbohydrates, but that's kind of a little bit more advanced. If you want to learn more about calorie cycling and carb cycling, you can check out my soft prep recovery guide. That is linked in the description. That goes very, very into the details. It tells you exactly how to figure out how many carbs is right for you, how many calories is right for you, how many of the other macronutrients is right for you, and gets really into the weeds. So you can kind of consider that, but that's what I would consider. Just remember that even though carbs are non-essential, which means you could never eat a carb again and still live, not the same as fat or protein, you need those are essential. But for performance, I would argue that carbs are highly essential, and you definitely want to make sure that you're eating enough of them. Next question. On Jack Gazelle, do you increase load week to week for the same exercises? Yes. In Jack Gazelle, there are percentages on each of the main lifts. So whatever percentage you see, that's where you're going to be hitting. So last week, if you saw 86%, you're probably going to see a range 83 to 86% on, say, a squat. The next week, you might see 87% to 89%, and you'll go up in load, therefore. So yes, that is the goal. However, because everyone's preparedness day to day is going to fluctuate based on lots of different things going on in your life, your stress, your sleep, your nutrition, your previous training, and just general overall preparedness. I included a range. So maybe you might see some overlaps in the ranges. So for example, in the program, one week you might see 83 to 86%. The following week you might see 85 to 88%. And there's some overlap there. So the reason for the ranges is because of that preparedness thing. And maybe you're less prepared the following week and you use the same load and you do the same amount of reps. That is not regression. That is smart. It's actually an intelligent, high IQ thing to do. For whatever reason, and I kind of know the reason, it's just because this is like how the fitness industry works. It just says every time you train, you should progress and you should add load. But that is not realistic. Your body's not on this like perfect 7-day schedule where like you lift a certain amount for a certain amount of reps this week, and then no matter what next week, you're gonna be able, bar none, to add 5 pounds or 10 pounds to the bar. That's just not how the body works. It's not how physiology works. So sometimes you might not add weight the following week, and that's okay. It's way better to not add weight the following week. Maybe you do the same loads, same reps, same exercise, and maybe it's a little bit easier this week than it was last week. That's progress. Way better to do that than it is to force yourself to add load or reps or both and mess yourself up or dig yourself deeper into a recovery hole. So listening to your body is huge, but the weights should be prescribed in the program. As far as the accessory lifts, the weights are not prescribed. So therefore, yes, you can add load. You're not going to be able to add load to every lift every week, but as the rep range gets a little bit easier, you can kind of go up in load. It's called double progression, and that's the way I would approach it to make the best progress. Next question, I'm going on deployment soon. Is it smart to go to SFAS immediately after if I'm ready? If you're ready, absolutely. It depends on your deployment. I mean, if your deployment's a pretty chill, relaxed, not very stressful, not very high op tempo style deployment, then absolutely. If you are going to the shit and you are not going to be able to eat what you want, you're probably not going to sleep optimally. You may not have access to certain training or locations. You might not be able to even train when you want to train. Then totally different story. You might want to wait a little bit after you get back and get a good train up in. But if you're ready, like the question said, absolutely. Nothing wrong with that. I would say send it. Next question, can you run Gazelle 2.0 back to back? Yeah, you absolutely can. I wouldn't run it like 3 times in a row, but if you want to run it back to back, no problem. I would say maybe take a week where you kind of chill out and don't do much training in between. It's a pretty high intensity program, especially towards the end. So maybe having like a little deload week, you can use the deload week from Gazelle if you want, or you can kind of just take a few days off, maybe 4 or 5 days off where you just don't train at all. Or you could do a couple full body lifts and some easy running for the week or some easy conditioning if you're feeling a little banged up from running, and then get back into it. But nothing wrong with following it twice in a row. I just would not continue doing it time after time after time. You can definitely follow it more than twice total, but I would interrupt it with a different program in between, something like Gazelle or 2 and 5 mile or Ruck Run Lift, really whatever you want. Next question. Ooh, this is a good one. Did you think you were going to get selected when going through? It's funny you say that because no, I honestly did not know until they called my name at the very end. I didn't think I was going to make it until they called my name. And I performed pretty highly at SOPC. I performed highly during gate week. I won all the gates minus the short ruck. I found all my land nav points. I got a ton of blue slips and no pink slips during team week. And I still was like not sure if that was enough. Now that's like totally irrational, but I just like didn't know any better. I didn't know, like I had nothing to compare it to other than the other guys that were there, but I still like just wasn't sure. So you might feel like that. Even if you crush everything, you're most likely going to feel a little bit of doubt and uncertainty. That's just like kind of part of the process. And I wouldn't be ashamed of it. I wouldn't think less of yourself because you feel that way. It's just kind of how a lot of people are wired. Kind of like imposter syndrome. You feel like you just don't belong, even though you are proving to yourself, you're starting to prove to yourself and other people you do belong. At selection, that's like the first chance you get to do that. So you're not really used to it yet. You don't really have a bunch of evidence stacked up to say like, I am who I say I am. I am who people think I am. So that's the way I felt. And I felt like that even at the long walk. Like when I got to the end, I thought for sure they were going to kick me out when I went to the board. And they ended up not kicking me out, and I was happy to accept their job offer. But yeah, you might feel that way. Not a bad thing. It's just kind of part of the process for some people. That doesn't mean like if you don't feel like that way, then you're wrong, or you should try and feel that way, but you just might feel that way. Everyone's a little different. Next question, favorite pre-workout snack before a lift? So I personally like to do something really high carb, like fast digesting carb. I talked about rice and grinds earlier. That's usually my pre-workout. If I'm eating a little further away, then I'll have like more of a meal, but usually rice and grinds and whey protein, maybe a banana topped on. If it's not right before my workout, that's my go-to. So usually 60 to 80 grams of carbs, sometimes up to 100 if it's a little further out, and 40 to 50 grams of protein. And I try to keep fat low, like very low, if not no fat. In whey protein plus rice and grinds plus a banana, that's like maybe 2 grams of fat from the protein. The other things are just carbohydrates. So the things you want to reduce or keep low or limit before training are fat and fiber. That doesn't mean you should reduce or limit fat and fiber all the time. It just means before training. Those things both slow digestion down, and you want fast digesting foods that you can immediately use for energy if you're having a pre-workout meal. Now, if you're eating further away, 2 hours, 3 hours plus, not a big deal. You can definitely have some fat and fiber. I wouldn't crank them super high, like have a half a jar of peanut butter or like 3 avocados or something, but you can definitely have a little bit higher because you just have more time to digest it. But the closer you are to training, the lower the fat and fiber you want to keep it. And rice and grinds is a go-to. If you are not interested in rice and grinds, no big deal. You can have something like white rice and some eggs, or maybe an egg plus egg whites, or you could have some white rice and beef, lean beef or chicken or something like that. Or, if you don't really have time, or if you're training first thing in the morning, you want to get some carbs in, you could do some liquid carbs, whether it's supplemental or Gatorade or fruit juice or something like that. That's also an option. So lots of different things to choose from, but those are my go-tos. Next question. I've been off on my training recently, have just been completely exhausted. Any suggestions? So if you're super exhausted, I would highly suggest prioritizing sleep. That is going to be the number one thing. Do not be super exhausted all the time anymore. So prioritizing sleep, basically there's any number of different things you can do. The thing I would start with is going to bed and waking up at the same time, and making sure the last hour of your day is not full of scrolling or watching screens. Maybe read, maybe do some meditation, maybe do some journaling, maybe chat with your spouse if you have one, maybe pet your dogs, maybe prepare for the next day. Just basic things that don't involve looking at a screen, because that will blunt melatonin production. Melatonin helps you fall asleep, and you don't want that. Those two things right there are huge. If you want to add one more thing to it, it would be getting outside in the morning sometime after sunrise and actually looking towards the sun, not staring directly in the sun, but like looking towards the sun, exposing your eyes, exposing your skin, as much skin as possible to the sun. That kind of lets your body know it's daytime, and that later on that evening, it's going to be nighttime. Lastly, if you're super exhausted, you might be really relying on stimulants like caffeine. I would highly suggest trying to break that chain, because it basically is just this self-propagating thing. So you're super tired, so you smash caffeine all day, and then that caffeine, especially caffeine in the afternoon, is going to disrupt your sleep. And so you're going to be getting a shitty night's sleep, and you're going to be super tired the next day, and so on and so forth. So if you can just suck it up for a day or two and really cut down, or maybe even cut out the caffeine, but especially cut it down, especially in the afternoon or after, within like 10 hours of bed, then that's going to be a huge one. Beyond that, getting back into training, to me, this sounds like you're in like a little bit of a rut, which lots of people get in ruts. It's totally normal to kind of get in ruts, whether it's with training, whether it's with work, whether it's with really whatever that you want to do and you want to be good at, you want to improve and benefit from, but for whatever reason you're not doing it. Totally normal. Here's the thing. When you get in ruts, when people generally get in ruts or they fall off, like the question said, usually it's a bunch of little things that compound over time. It's usually not like you're crushing one day and then the next day you're just right in a rut. However, when people try to get out of ruts, they try to just completely lock in and be perfect and change all these different things all at once and be like, okay, I'm getting back on the train. And that's not very intelligent, because it's probably not going to work. You're probably going to get burnt out after a short period of time, and then you're going to get into another rut or have to take another training hiatus, whether it's because you're not motivated or you're just beat up or you hurt yourself or something like that. So slowly start focusing on small wins and small habits that kind of build on each other. Instead of trying to completely renovate and change your life, just start with small things like, hey, this week I'm going to go to the gym 3 times and I'm going to spend at least 45 minutes there. Not only is that a smart thing for physical progress, because you've been not training for a while, so really any stimulus is going to be beneficial for you, and too much stimulus is not. But also it's going to help you kind of get in that habit, and it's going to help you prove to yourself that you can stick to something that you decided to stick to, that you told yourself you were going to stick to, which is huge for confidence and self-esteem. And having confidence in yourself and believing in yourself, like when you make a commitment, whether anyone knows about it or not, is massive. And a lot of people get into ruts by breaking promises to themselves. One after another, slowly over time, nothing huge, but it adds up and boom, they're in a rut. So reverse engineer that to get out of the rut by giving yourself small targets, hitting those targets for the first week. For example, maybe that's your only thing for the first week. I would definitely focus on the sleep first, the things I talked about earlier. That's going to set you up for success getting out of the rut more than anything else. But maybe it's you prioritize those things for sleep and you go to the gym 3 times first week. Maybe the second week, you track your protein. Make sure you're eating about a gram per pound of body weight of protein. Maybe the third week, you try and get 10,000 steps a day or 8,000 steps a day, whatever it is, and so on and so forth. You just choose one thing per week or 2 weeks or whatever it is, and slowly work your way out of the rut. And you're just going to be able to most likely sustain it for longer. And it's also going to be like less daunting. You're not going to basically give yourself all these things that you have to stick to, and then you're going to feel bad about yourself if you miss one, and so on and so forth. So one book that I recommend is Atomic Habits by James Clear. I would recommend that really to anyone. And I bet you a lot of people who are listening to this have already read it, but that will give you a good idea of how to build habits in a reasonable, proper way that are actually going to last and you're going to be able to stick to, rather than just trying to do everything, reinvent the wheel, and boom, you're just in a rut again. Next question, what's a realistic time frame between Ranger School and planning to attend a selection? Again, just like the Sapper question, this one will depend on how much Ranger School beats you up and how quickly you can recover from it. But I would say at least if you're a super stud, maybe 2 months, maybe 3 months. I had a buddy who just got out. He was in the unit for a while, and he was in 7th group before that, but he went to SFAS less than a month after Ranger School. And although he would be the first to tell you he does not recommend it, he still made it, even though he didn't perform the way he otherwise would have if he was not fresh off Ranger School. It still can be done if you're a stud. But even if you are a stud, honestly, I would recommend at least probably 3 months or so. That gives you a month to just kind of recover and rejuvenate, and then like a 2-month train up. If you're less of a stud, and or even if you are a physical fitness freak, but you, for whatever reason, recycled Ranger School, at least one phase, maybe even more than one phase, you stayed way longer than the 61 days, then that might be a consideration to push it a little further right. Just because being there for that long and going through multiple phases multiple times, or even going through one phase multiple times, is just more stressful on the body in general. So you might want a little longer for recovery. I will say I understand the desire to go to SFAS as quickly as possible, especially if you're in the regular Army and you just want to get out of there. You want to go where the grass is greener. Get it, totally. But also, you don't want to go to selection when you're not prepared, or when you're super beat up or run down, because you're just going to get more beat up and run down while you're at selection. So even if you have to wait an extra month or 2 months longer than you wanted to, or that you in a perfect world would desire to, sometimes that's worth it, because although nothing wrong with going to selection twice, that's not the goal. The goal is to go once and make it and go to the Q course. Plenty of guys go twice, and that's fine. But if you are jumping the gun and going back to selection too early, then you're kind of a little bit more blade running, and your chances are a little bit lower. Even if you are super fit and a freak, you're probably not going to be at 100% if you go to selection, say 6 weeks or 8 weeks after Ranger School. That's just kind of like how the body works. So anywhere between 3 months, if you're a super stud, and or you just went straight through and you feel good, to 6 months, maybe for some people 8 months. It might take certain people quite a while to recover. And it also has to do with what you do after Ranger School. I've talked about this a lot in the past, but some people have this narrative, and it's a very common narrative. It's more common than the narrative I'm about to tell you, that Ranger School is just this thing that is going to destroy your health, and it's going to take 5 years off your life, and your hormones are going to be fucked forever. Your joints are going to be fucked forever, and it's going to take you forever to recover from Ranger School. And although that is the case for some people, it's usually the case for those people because they don't do the right things after. So getting back on your sleep schedule, getting back on your nutrition regimen, getting back into a sound training program, not jumping the gun, not rushing into it, not going ham early on, but easing back into training and knowing that you're not a fragile individual. You are resilient. Your body is resilient if you believe it and you do the right things that actually display the fact that you are resilient, rather than just kind of like sitting and sulking. Oh, I went to Ranger School. I'm just going to take 6 months before I consider myself better. That's just not the best attitude. It's not the best mindset to have around it. So make sure you are not giving yourself that narrative where Ranger School is just going to destroy you for however long, and that you are not fragile and you can bounce back. You're resilient. Resiliency, the definition of resiliency is how quickly someone gets back to baseline after a stressor. So Ranger School is a big stressor, but if you're a resilient individual and you do the right things, you can get back to that baseline pretty quick. And then obviously prep for selection, you want to get above your current baseline because you're going to selection and you should be. But just kind of go about it with that mindset and do the right things after selection, but also don't jump the gun too quickly. Next question, I can do repeat sessions 1 minute plus faster than time trials. Should I continue that fast or slow down to specified time? Great question. And it does depend, but it depends on the length of the time trial. If you're doing your repeats at 6 minutes per mile and you're running like a half marathon at like 7 minutes per mile, still not the best programming. You still probably should slow down your repeats, but it's not quite as big of a discrepancy. And there's still benefit to maybe sometimes running 6 minute miles for your speed work. But say it's like a 2 mile and you're doing your 2 mile run, say at a 13 minute 2 mile. So that's 6:30 miles. And you're doing your repeats at 5:30. You're not really getting the adaptations that you otherwise could be. So in that case, I would definitely slow down. It does depend on the type of repeats. You can do repeats at your goal pace. You can do repeats faster than your goal pace. You can even do certain repeats at your current pace, depending on how long the repeat is, the rest periods, and all that kind of stuff. But most people do repeats way too fast, given the rest period and given the goal of the training. A lot of people will do repeats, the actual running portion, like a sprinter. So they'll go as hard as they can or very close to as hard as they can. But then they rest. The prescribed rest periods for endurance style speed work are not long enough for you to fully recover your ATP PC energy system, which is kind of the main energy system involved in sprints. You're kind of not really working on your ATP PC energy system when you're doing 200s, 400s, 600s, 800s mile repeats. That's more anaerobic. That's more aerobic. A little bit of a mix of both, depending on what the fine print is in the actual workout prescription. So in that case, you don't want to be going all out on the repeats because you're not going to be resting long enough for you to recover and repeat that effort. Whereas if you slow things down and you go, say, your goal pace, in this case, if you're in this example, I would say if you're running a 13-minute 2 mile, 6:30 miles, a good solid goal pace, depending on when your next 2 mile would be, but like a good pace to consider doing goal pace intervals would be like 6:05 to 6:10 per mile. And it does depend on the length of the intervals. Maybe 200s would be a little faster than that. 400s right around there. Maybe 800s slightly slower, but not by all that much. Really depends on lots of different nuances. But yes, if you are going 1+ minute slower than your time trial, you're probably doing your repeats too fast, depending on what the repeats are. But in most cases, you definitely are. And coincidentally, if you slow down the repeats a little bit, they'll be less fatiguing, more stimulative, more specifically stimulative. You'll make better adaptations. And guess what? You're going to have most likely better time trial performances. So really cool question. Really glad you asked. This is a super common mistake is people doing repeats way too fast. You'll notice in all my programs, I have actual pacing suggestions and pacing prescriptions, and I would recommend sticking to those if you want to get the best results. But also if you're not following my programs, that's still a general recommendation. Lots and lots of nuances on repeats and how fast or how slow to run them. But generally, if you're doing them a minute plus faster than your current ability, usually a little bit too hot. Next question, tips on staying hydrated pre and during ruck. Yeah, this is brutal this time of year. Basically, when you're rucking or when you're doing any sort of endurance training and it's hot and you are doing long enough, so like an hour plus, long enough to where you need to hydrate during it, the game you're playing is more of a dehydration mitigation game rather than a staying perfectly hydrated game. You're going to lose more water and electrolytes per hour than the body is capable of taking in, most likely in most cases. If it's freezing out and you're not a very heavy sweater, that might be a different story. But this time of year, I don't care if you're not a heavy sweater, you're still going to lose more than what you're able to replace. The body can only take in so much water and so many electrolytes per hour while in a stressed out state, aka running or rucking. And a lot of people will overload their water intake. In this case, it sounds like you're not taking in enough water. So I'll get into some specifics on a good range to kind of shoot for. So starting with something like 24 ounces of water per hour, give or take, probably give or take 8 to 10 ounces, is a pretty good idea. Something like 750 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium, depending on how salty of a sweater you are. You can get a sweat test. Gatorade makes these little patches you can put on your arm that shows you how salty your sweat is. But honestly, you can kind of rudimentarily, if that's a word, tell by looking at your clothes and your hat. Like if your eyes sting when you're sweating a lot, like really, really sting, they get super red. Or if your hat has like these salt stains on it, your shirt, whatever, then you're probably a pretty salty sweater. In which case I would err on the side of higher sodium intake. If not, erring on the side of a little bit lower, 500, 750 milligrams of sodium per hour, give or take, would be a solid place to be. Now, over time, with repetition and practice, just like fueling, you can get your body used to taking in more water. So maybe you start at 24, and that's way better than where you're at now, whatever you're at now. But over time, maybe you add 2 to 4 ounces of water every couple of rucks, and you get up to like 32 ounces. That's even better. Now, if you go overboard with it, which some people do, they'll slam a bunch of water. Oftentimes it's plain water too, without any electrolytes, which is really a no-go. And they're just like overhydrating themselves, overstressing their system, and it's backfiring on them. So you don't want to get crazy high. If you're having 40, 50 ounces of water per hour, which is not unheard of, especially given the fact that in the military, at selections and schools in the Q course, they require you to have something like 9 quarts of water on you for a 12-mile ruck. If you drink anywhere near all that water on a 12-mile ruck, you're going to overdo it. So again, 24-ish, give or take, ounces of water per hour, slowly, incrementally increasing that over time, kind of by feel, is a good idea. Pre-ruck, a lot easier. Really what you're going for is making sure your urine is straw colored. That's like the main thing to consider. So if your urine's super yellow, you're dehydrated. You need to increase your water and electrolyte intake. If your urine looks exactly like water, then you're overhydrating, you're overdoing it. And that's usually with type A guys who are really into fitness and like, I really want to go perform. They're going to show up overhydrated to most of these things. That's just, in my experience, the way things go. So somewhere in the middle there, straw colored urine. As far as daily hydration, a good baseline would be something like half an ounce of water per pound of body weight. And then you can titrate salt and sodium intake based on how salty your food is, as well as how much you're sweating that day and so on and so forth. But usually half an ounce per pound of body weight and another give or take 24 ounces per hour of sweating. So, if you go on a 90-minute ruck and then later that day you go in the sauna for 30 minutes, that's 2 hours of sweating. So that's another 48 ounces of water at bare minimum, and that's during. So you might want to, depending on what your urine looks like and depending on how much you sweat, depending on the environment, you might want to go even higher than that. Maybe another 16 on the front end and the back end of those. So that's a baseline hydration recommendation, but really what the game you're playing is just to remember that you're not going to be perfectly hydrated at the end of, say, a 3-hour ruck. But if you hydrate properly by doing what I just went over, then you're going to be way less dehydrated at the end of it compared to if you barely drank any water or if you just went to Pound Town on a bunch of plain water. So that's my suggestion. Next question. What was the dropout rate like during the Q course for your class? I don't really have statistics on it. I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that it was pretty, I wouldn't say easy, but it was a lot easier to get dropped from the Q course back then than it is now. Now, from what I understand, they're being way more selective at selection and giving guys more chances and more opportunities during the Q course to make it. So for us, it was 2 recycles. That's all you get throughout the entire Q course. Doesn't matter what phase you're in. So you could recycle like 1 phase of SOCM, Special Operations Combat Medic course, and then you could recycle, say, another phase like SUT. After that, you get recycled again, or if you don't pass a phase again, you're getting dropped, or you were getting dropped. That's how it worked. And I would say, honestly, most of the guys that I went to selection with that I was close with made it through the Q course, but not everyone. I had a couple of buddies that got dropped. They recycled a phase of SOCM, and they recycled IUW, the extra land nav that they did back then during the Q course. I don't think they do another land nav session in the Q course these days, but it was go, no go, and it was brutal conditions. I think I've talked about it in the past. It was like super hot, and we got smoked for a couple hours before we went out and did a land nav. So basically what I'm saying is it used to be hard, and now it's not. No, just kidding. But yeah, I don't have stats on it, but as far as I know, it was easier back then to get dropped than it is now. But either way, that shouldn't really affect your approach. Go and do what they tell you to do. Show up at the right time in the right uniform. Do what they tell you to do to the best of your ability. If you suck at it, practice it until you get better. Don't drink and drive. Don't drink and fight. Don't do anything dumb on weekends. Don't beat your wife. Really, really simple. It's not hard. Stay fit. Most importantly, stay fit. And you're going to pass. Like, that's literally the Q course in a nutshell. And yes, it's hard. It's harder than what I just made it out to be. Certain parts of it, especially. But it's really not that challenging to just do the right thing, show up at the right time in the right uniform, and try your best. And again, the main thing that gets guys dropped for performance is, yes, they try their best, maybe. But when they fail, they don't try hard enough to get better at whatever it is they fail. And so then they fail again. And everything in the Q course is just a series of skills. And if you suck at a skill, guess what? There's this thing called practice. And you can get better at any skill you want to by practicing it, putting in the time, putting in the effort, deliberately practicing, not just going through the motions, but deliberately practicing. It's stressful. It's hard. That's why most people don't practice things deliberately, because it's not really that easy to do. But really, that's what it takes to get better at certain things, especially if you're not a natural at it. And a lot of people who get dropped in the Q course, it's usually just a lack of effort thing. So, or it's just making dumb decisions, usually alcohol induced. So that is my best advice on Q course success. All right, we will do 2 more questions. First one, any tips for someone who doesn't struggle with strength, but biggest weakness is cardio? Do more cardio. Next question. No, just kidding. Well, yeah, do more cardio for sure, but I'll kind of get more into it. So some people, just depending on what your background was, if you played strength-based sports or power-based sports, as well as depending on what your genetics kind of look like. Some people are just naturally very prone to gaining strength and muscle. Other people are not. Some people are very, very prone to being great at cardio and kind of struggle to gain muscle. Other people are not. So in this case, it sounds like you're on the strength side. Maybe you played strength sports growing up, or your parents are just gave you the strength genetics, but you're lacking the cardio genetics. No big deal. Starting to do cardio. Honestly, it depends on what your goals are. If you want to end up going to selection or something like that, then I would definitely do like run biased cardio. That doesn't mean launch into like 50-mile weeks or anything like that. Ease into it. If you're interested in building a running base, go back to episode 95. And listen to that one. That's on audio only, but that'll give you a good idea of how to build your running volume up and do it in a way that is going to be most beneficial for you, as well as least likely to hurt you. Because a lot of people, when they go about running, they just do it improperly in many different ways. Too much volume, too fast, too soon, bad form, a combination of all those things, and they get hurt, or they just hate it so much that they just stop doing it and they take a bunch of time off, and then they go back into it again incorrectly and they hate it, or they get hurt, and so on and so forth. This cycle continues. So that episode will give you a good idea of how to do it right. If you have no interest in that kind of stuff, you don't have to run whatsoever. I would consider something like incline walking on a treadmill, Stairmaster, bike, row, swim, really whatever you prefer, whatever you enjoy doing. If you don't have specific performance goals for a certain cardio modality, just do whatever you like the most. That's actually cardio. A lot of people will think that like they have to do a certain modality if they're just doing cardio for like general well-being and health and heart health and longevity. Oh, I have to bike. Oh, I have to row. Oh, I have to do the Stairmaster. It's like this extra beneficial thing compared to other things. It's not like that. Most people struggle with long-term consistency with training in general, but especially cardio. And oftentimes it's because they're not doing something they enjoy. Even if you don't really enjoy going to the gym and sitting on a cardio machine, there's a lot of other things you can do. You can put a ruck on and go walk. You can run hill sprints. You can grab a rower, purchase a rower or a bike, put it in your driveway, get some sun, and do it outdoors. lots of different options besides just sitting on a cardio machine or standing on a treadmill and walking for however long. That stuff's kind of mind numbing for a lot of people. It's totally fine to do. It's beneficial to do, but there's other options. So without knowing really anything about your overall goals and what you're trying to do cardio for, whether it's for health, performance, a combination of both, I can't really give you anything like super specific, but if you're interested in a program, I would say 2 and 5 mile would probably be the best option because it actually has the run phase built in. Actually, Ruck Run Lift also has a run base phase built in. So either of those programs would be solid options if you're interested in more running biased cardio. If not, you could do any of my hybrid programs. You could do Gazelle. You could do Gazelle 2. Gazelle 1 has more variety as far as what you can choose for cardio. Gazelle 2 is more running and rucking based, but you could also just substitute a different modality if you're not interested in running and rucking. So that's the best I got for you. Best of luck with your cardio adventure, and continue to listen to the show, continue following, and hopefully you can pick up the pieces as far as what I'm dropping for cardio knowledge and recommendations and programming and structuring over time. Next and final question. Does it matter if my MAF heart rate, MAF is maffetone, maximum aerobic function, created by Dr. Maffetone, who's a very renowned running coach? Does it matter if my MAF heart rate is low zone 3, upper zone 2, or should I run slower? So the MAF heart rate is, by the way, 180 minus your age. So for example, I'm 35. My MAF heart rate would be 180 minus 35, which is 145. That would be the upper end, according to this, of my zone 2. It is one of the most rudimentary ways to establish your heart rate and your intensities to run at. So everyone is very, very different. Some people have higher heart rates. Some people have lower heart rates. Some people's zone 2 is going to be a little higher range. Some people's zone 2 is going to be a little lower range. Some people's zone 2 is going to be a little bigger. Super fit individuals, like really, really high level runners, have a tiny little zone 2 range. That's just the way it is. And you can definitely affect it over time based on your fitness. But just subtracting your age from 180 and thinking that that is the gold standard of your upper limit of zone 2 is way too rudimentary in most cases. Now, if you want to just generally be healthy and live longer and get benefits of cardio, using the MAF formula is totally fine. You're probably not doing enough cardio to where it's going to negatively affect you too much. But if you're training for performance, you're doing a lot of higher intensity cardio as well, you're doing just a general overall higher training workload, then monitoring your heart rate and being in the right zones is a little bit more important. So if you've been running for a really long time and this is the case for you, and you run a lot of volume and you train a lot in general, and maybe you're not recovering all that well, then yeah, I'd probably slow down. If you are doing a lower volume of running, if you are newer to running, if you're recovering really well, then I would not worry about it. I would not give it another thought. What you could do is consider either using RPE and just going 5-6 RPE for easy runs. That's fine for most people. Or you can test it by being able to say a 12-ish word sentence without having to pause for a breath or really recover your breath afterwards. Being able to breathe through your nose is a pretty rudimentary one, not perfect, but can work for some people. Or you can go and get tested in a lab and find out what your max heart rate is. Or you could do a at-home max heart rate test. There's lots of different options. If you just Google or ChatGPT, how can I test my max heart rate? They'll give you a shit ton of options and you can go from there. But those are all probably less stressful and less majoring in the minors than worrying about exactly what your MAF formula is. And if you want to get really specific, of course, that's like the max heart rate. Find your max heart rate. 60 to 70% of that is your zone 2, give or take. Or if you want to just go a little bit more by feel, you can do the other things and you're going to be totally fine. Unless, of course, you're training with a super high workload and a super high volume, and or you're struggling to recover. That's honestly the number one thing to ask yourself. Am I recovering well and making progress in general in my training? If so, I wouldn't worry about potentially being slightly in zone 3. If not, it may not just be that, but maybe dialing back your intensity on your easier runs or your long runs might be something that you should consider. It may help you recover a little better, but it could also be any number of different things in your training or outside training, your lifestyle. So MAF is a decent basic formula, especially if your goal is not performance. If I just wanted to be healthy and do cardio for well-being and longevity and general health, and I just shot for 145 as my max zone 2 heart rate, I'd be totally fine. If I was running 70 miles a week and also lifting and training very intense and doing speed work and tempo work and a lot of other running besides the zone 2 stuff, then I would probably want to get more granular with it and figure out exactly what my zone 2 range is, because it may affect me being in zone 3 too often. So that is my recommendation. Don't overthink it too much. I think you're totally fine. But if you're not recovering well, you might want to slow down. If you are, stay where you're at. And that is it, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'll be back soon with another episode. Till then, Terminator out.